I studied biology in grad school, and particularly evolutionary biology, because I've always been interested in, the ultimate why questions. So, I always ask why like 5 times on everything, and it always goes down to evolutionary biology for like every social thing. And so once you start reading into this evolutionary biology, you see that there are reasons why men and women might have evolved to be slightly different, and that actually shows up in some of our disparities. And I mean, there are of course a lot of arbitrary social norms that we could change and have changed throughout history, but we shouldn't ignore that there might still be some differences that we shouldn't necessarily, and seek to eliminate. And there's the flip side of this too, where there's so many negative qualities that men have that we aren't trying to get women to have too. And there's so many disparities in males' disfavor that we just don't care about, like prison population and college dropouts and high school dropouts. And so, I basically laid out some personality traits and particularly the differing interest in people versus things. That's one of the largest gender differences. And that has been shown to be linked to career choice very strongly. And, engineering is a very thing-oriented and system-oriented thing. Systemizing versus empathizing is similar to the people versus things thing. And so I'm not the first one to even say this stuff, but and then there are other things too, like, and this I eventually removed from the document, but I think it's actually pretty important, is that men and women tend to score about the same on math tests now, but women score higher on verbal tests. And if you look at the type of people that go into engineering, it's actually the people that are high on math and low on verbal. Because people that are high on verbal, they don't need to be sitting in front of the screen doing random coding stuff all day. They they end up going into product management or just some other more BS and career, because those are in some ways easier, and like that's not a diss on people that go into them. It's just people without the verbal skills can't do that, and they can. And if you look at program manager and product manager, that's actually 50-50 men and women. So, so I guess there was that part of the document, and then the actual, policy suggestions, where I suggested that, a lot of these programs aren't doing what they are intended to do. They are actually increasing tensions within the company. They are enforcing some moral standard that is inherently asymmetric. And, there are certain things that men aren't even allowed to talk about. And, my firing was a perfect example of that, where, I mean, I don't think that a woman would have been fired for what I did. And, I've talked to several people and they were like, yes, men can't talk about certain things. And then I asked them, are there any things that women can't talk about? And they're like, no, of course not.
Yeah.
Um, and I mean, there were several other things of just, actually not being so hostile towards conservatives. And, I don't actually have like a dog in this race because I'm not actually conservative, but it just seemed like the obvious thing to do. And it makes like all of tech so disconnected with the rest of the world if they are so isolated in their liberal bubble, right? And politics is definitely turning against them at this point. So,
Yeah. Sorry. I don't know if you're finished, but you were going for a while. And I started to, no, it's okay. Just moving towards stuff I was going to ask later. Um, again, I think that you were saying that you were almost speaking when other people weren't willing to speak. So you weren't the only person thinking these things, and you were sort of geared towards team cohesion and making sure that people's voices were people felt more comfortable in their team space, which was kind of your job from what you're saying. And two of the things that you pointed out in your memo were that people already know how to acknowledge much of their bias, such as, I don't know, like some prejudice based on gender, for example, but not their political bias. And so that was kind of what you were going for, and what Google seems, and many tech companies seem to be completely blind to. And then I also wanted to talk about this difference between men and women, which, yeah, it's not just you. I also studied biology, but not at a master's level, but as an undergraduate. And I do think that most of the people who this is their expert field of knowledge agree with you. So you're not just, drawing statements out of thin air. It's based on research. And in terms of men looking at things more so than people, that's true. And then something else that you mentioned in your memo was men seek status, which is something that women are more likely to want to have a balanced life. And there was this paper that talks about the greater male variability hypothesis, which is kind of what you talk about. Like, men have more variation, and I was just like re-looking at these things again in preparation for this interview. And something that's really struck me was that there is a theory surrounding the theory of why there is greater male variability. So you have more men at the higher and lower ends of some of the spectrum. So you have more men who are like CEOs and bosses, and more men who are homeless, and women tend to be more average. And there were this theory. It's actually this paper. It was by a I'm not sure. I'm not sure what his title is, but there was someone called Theodore Hill, I think it was. And I have it in one of my videos called So Much for Science, if anyone wants to go look up that paper. And there were writers who wrote this paper. It was a mathematical model explaining the variability, male variability hypothesis. And it was so funny to me, because they were basically saying that the reason why men display more variability was because women they select for that. They more aggressively select, say, a guy with higher status than a guy would, who's like less selective. So a lot of these issues that we're seeing that are so called due to the fault of men can actually turn back to how women are selecting men as their mates. So I just thought that was super interesting, and I want to stress that this kind of information is not just opinion, and yes, empathy is important. And I think I personally really liked your paper because you went from the facts to like, hey, but maybe there is something that we can do. So I think it's awful that you're basically being negatively socially sanctioned by being fired when you're actually trying to combine the facts and the reason, which is very important. You can't make decisions that are not based on reality with trying to solve the problem because you recognize that this is an issue that people care about. Um,
Mhm.
so can you talk a bit about the solutions that you
Yeah.
came up with for
Uh-huh.
bringing
Yeah.
more women into tech?
So for many of the gender differences, there's a potential way that we could leverage that to increase the women's representation in tech. Like, one was because women tend to be more social, pair programming, which is actually working with another person while you're coding. That could be something that women like more than men. And this is something that no one has really studied, but maybe it works. I mean, at least based on some theories like that, it seems like it could. And another one was that women tend to be more cooperative than men, and our current promotion process, or Google's promotion process at the time, heavily favored people that just launched things, and there was no real way to measure oh, this person helped with these 10 other teams, and so they are actually overperforming, there was just no way to measure that. And so we should have, or Google should have changed their promotion process such that somehow this cooperative behavior, which seems good for Google, right, should be promoted. Uh, there were and some other things about just stress management and
Mm-hmm.
there's general things in tech too where uh, there's a pattern in industries of the more an industry changes over time, the lower women's representation in it. Because I mean, the theory at least is that women tend to take time out of work to raise a family for a little bit, and so they get that if they, for example, leave for 5 years and the industry has changed a ton in those 5 years, then they're in a huge disadvantage. And so
Mm-hmm.
that could lead to them not coming back or not even choosing the industry in the first place. And tech is one of the biggest changing industries right now, right? So there may be ways in which we are actually hurting women by requiring that they know all the latest technology, for example.